Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're gonna be doing something a little bit different. Today we're gonna be looking at some scene design and in general a very cool technique using PolyBrush, which is a package that's available in Unity that makes adding props to your scene very easy. So let's start by just seeing what we have right here. Off camera, I set up this scene where we have a bunch of prefabs that make up an environment. If you look at it, it is just a very simple kind of flat terrain. This is built by a number of props. This is all from an asset pack. So we have a road prop, we have some tiles for ground, we have some other prefabs for some more textured objects that we have here, and we have other prefabs here. This more dirt-like, and then I have this other one that's a little bit more like sand. So it's a very simple scene right now. It has a bit of a structure, not a final draft or anything like that. It's simply a test scene to test the environment here. But we do have a base layer that we can use here to work on. The really cool thing comes when we use PolyBrush. And if you want to install PolyBrush, just go to the package manager here and search for PolyBrush, and you should have it. If you don't have it, check out the preview packages here and make sure that you have show preview packages. But I think that PolyBrush is out of preview, so it should be available to you. And then you can add some shaders here if you want and all that. But yeah, once you have PolyBrush is a very powerful tool, and I'm not going to cover everything here. You have a mesh sculpting tool here that you can use to modify a mesh. It's actually very cool. You can use this to smooth out the geometry. And once you do your sculpting, you have a vertex painter here that you can select different colors and you can apply them here. It's also very cool. And you have a texture painter where you can define a set of textures and then you can add it there. All of those features are amazing, and I recommend you look into them if you're interested. The one that we're going to be using here today is the mesh scatterer. This tool is super powerful. It allows you to select a number of prefabs basically that you want to instantiate, and then you can use the PolyBrush engine here to sort of paint those prefabs into the scene. It allows for very quick placement of the kind of prefabs that you're going to have tons of, and it makes things very easy. It has a few settings that are worth playing around with. It has a brush size. You can see here this tiny dot. You can change that. There are shortcuts for it. I believe the Control and Scroll changes the size of the outer radius. Shift changes the size of the inner radius. And then I think Control and Shift changes the strength. I'm just going to reset to default 0.7 strength, which is what I was using before. Then you have here a palette. When you start with the default palette here, you just have these drop prefabs here prompt. I set up a number of prefabs here for the trees. Each one of these trees has a mesh. I added a mesh collider because they didn't have it, but I also added some scripts here because this is much like if you didn't see in a previous video where I was looking into spawning items based on damage. We have damageable script that makes an object take damage and die. And then we have a spawner script that spawns items on death. And we have these two tied together here to allow the tree to be damaged. And when it takes enough damage, it spawns logs, as you'd expect a tree to do. And we're going to use the axe here. I have an axe in the scene to actually hit the trees and get them to spawn the logs. But I have that set up for every tree model here. So each one of these 16 prefabs has a different tree model, but they'll have the same damageable and instant spawner scripts that allow them to drop logs when you hit them with the axe. So I went on and basically just select all of them here and drag them into the drop prefab upon creating a new palette here. So now I have a palette full of trees, and then having this many, it's a little bit cumbersome because you do have to set each one individually, which is not ideal. But you can set up a few things. For one is the scale randomization. Here I made it very subtle. It's between 0.9 and 1.3, so the trees are slightly shorter and slightly larger depending on the randomization, but they're not huge or tiny. And then you can set up a rotation here. For this kind of model, it only makes sense to rotate it on the y-axis because you don't want to flip the tree over or sideways. You just want it to spin around the trunk. So I set Y to be able to spin freely anywhere between 0 and 360 degrees. The orientation of the tree is going to be completely random, which is great for this kind of workflow. So once you have set up each one of these, I set up most of them with the same settings except for a few meshes that are a little bit more complicated. That makes sense. As larger trees, I set the scale here a little bit larger for them. But overall, once they're all set here, you just click on the checkboxes to select them and they go into the brush loadout. In the loadout here, you can individually change the frequency if you want, for example, to have a lot more of this type of tree and a lot less of this type of tree. You can modify this on the fly. Then you have a few settings here. Use pivot. If you don't select this, PolyBrush will just drop the mesh at the center, which for example for a tree would be kind of in the middle of the trunk, which wouldn't be that nice. You can probably see it here if I select. Here is with a pivot, and then without the pivot here. You can see. Actually for this, it's not that bad. Yeah, you can see they're working fine. And for flat surfaces, I think it's kind of cool. It gets a little bit more complicated with surfaces that have more curves to them. So if we look at this one here, you can see them here. Without the pivot, the trees are kind of just floating in the air. If you use the pivot, they're a little bit better. With the pivot, they're a little bit closer to the ground here. That's it for that. And then you have hit surface is parent. If you have this selected, then whatever you're painting on, anything that gets spawned will be a child object of that transform. For my use case, I don't need them to be parented to the surfaces here. So I'm going to keep that off, and then they will just spawn at the root, and then I'll place them wherever I need them. So that's basically it. One thing is that you can only paint on selected objects. So what I did here is open these two collections of objects that I want to paint over, select them all. And one thing that you want to keep in mind is that you can only paint over the object that you first click on. So if I click on this object here, it's going to paint on this object, but it's not going to cross over to this other object here, the flat tile here with the spots. You can actually see I can move the mouse around, but once I move outside of the object, it's gone. But then if I click on the tile, because the tile is selected, I can also paint on the tile. You just need to remember that you cannot paint outside of the object that you first clicked. So you need to remember to drop the mouse and click again when you want to switch objects. So as you can see, you can probably already tell how powerful this is. Just in a few clicks here, I have populated the forest here. I'm going to put a few other ones here and then switch to this side, making sure to click in every new object that I want to select. That's it. The one thing that I wanted to be careful here is because the tiles are below some of the meshes. It's easy to make a mistake and place the tree on the tile when you want to put it on one of these mounts. But as long as you keep in mind to let go of the mouse every once in a while, especially as you're switching between objects, then it should be fine. And with that, we quickly get a tiny forest here. You can see it's pretty cool. One thing that I've had with this kind of mesh here that comes from this asset pack is that some of the trees don't hit the ground as nicely. That obviously depends on the randomization and wherever the tree gets placed, but there are a few trees that, because of the inclination of the ground, they're kind of floating tiny bit above ground. That creates a weird shadow at times. For example, you can see this one here. This one here is actually floating above ground a little bit. But that's fine. The way I go about it is just have all of them selected, and then I have here a trees object, and then I can just move the parent a little bit down. So let's move that a little bit down, and then all the trees now are intersecting with the ground. It makes the aesthetics a lot better because now you can be sure that none of the trees is sticking out of the ground because of a weird rotation or anything like that. I think that for me in this kind of setup, minus 0.1 to minus 0.12 was the sweet spot, not to lose too much of the trunk of the trees for the ones that are placed properly, while still trying to cover and make sure that there's no sticking edges there. So now, since we have it here, let's just quickly put this in VR so you can see how it looks. Cool. Same as usual, because we have Steam VR, we need to reset the scene. Now with the scene reset, we have hands. I have this axe here. You can see which is distance grabbable. We will look at that later. Right now the physics here are not great, but it gets the job done. We'll probably fix the axe and other tools in a later episode, but you can see here, now that I can walk, get closer to the trees, and the way that we have things set up, if I hit the tree, it dies, it drops some logs, I can grab the logs. And that basically applies to any tree. I can go to any tree in this scene and just go, hit it a bit, and there it is. For now, the frame rate seems a little bit choppy. I think that's mostly on the editor. When testing it out on the device, it's actually a lot smoother. But again, your mileage may vary depending. This is a very simple asset pack. They're all polygon-based meshes, so they're super cheap to render. But yeah, that's basically what we have here. I'll continue adding more of these prefabs here to the scene. Obviously, the trees are the important ones for the gameplay, at least on this biome. We'll later see about other resources. But once we have these, I'll move into other details like adding grass, and there's some rocks that need to be added to the dirt and sand part of the scene, and just in general dress it up a little bit so it makes a bit more sense as a scene. And then we'll add the merchant. There's this big wide open area here for the merchant and all of that, and that should give us a basic starter set to start wiring things together and see how everything that we've been building comes together. But cool, that's all that I wanted to show you for now. Just wanted to show off PolyBrush because it's so very cool. You should totally try it out. And yeah, I will see you in the next one. Thanks.